Khary, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today, to be in conversation with us today, especially because I'm guessing you were hanging out for quite a while on Zoom last night, partying at your gala, huh?
Thank you for the invitation very much. It wasn't partying at the gala. We did have a wonderful celebration, and it was a great way to celebrate the work of brother and sister. So
that's wonderful, wonderful that you took time to be with us. And the last time you were in our Zoom room was 9 months ago in July, when we first met you at our Meet the Authors session with 5 or 6 other authors. And you introduced us to your book, Passage, a novel, and then Riverside Book Club folks went on to vote to read it. And we're just so pleased now that we have read it, that you're able to join us again this morning. I'm thinking I'll jump right in. I just could begin with what is a constant reality in America for people of color. And that is violence, violence particularly against Black and brown male bodies. Right now, of course, media attention is on George Floyd and Officer Chauvin is being, and I don't know what's going on with that. I'll leave that alone. But long before George Floyd, and certainly since George Floyd, how many others? And of course, your novel Passage centers on 17-year-old Warrior. And throughout the novel, we see how violence looks and how violence feels in many forms of violence that Warrior must encounter every day once he leaves the loving homes of his family. And one of the forms of those many forms of violence we find in Passage is also a form of violence that Riverside Book Club folks we've found in other works by Black male writers, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man to Richard Wright's Black Boy, we read 2 years ago, to Charles Blow's Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which we read about 4 years ago. And most recently, just a few months ago, we read about that form of violence in Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys. And of course, that particular form of violence against Black and brown male bodies is the battle royal or battle royale. So I want to open up now. Khary, why do you think this particular form of violence is repeatedly depicted in the telling of coming of age stories about Black boys? And sort of as an adjunctive to that, why did you choose to depict that in Passage, but in a way that we have not seen before? It's via a letter from Brother Man. So.
Sure. So first, I want to thank you all so much for reading Passage and inviting me today to join you. It means a tremendous amount. And so I thank you for your choice in literature, and I thank you for the invitation and having me today. I really appreciate it. So, it's a wonderful question. I think first I would say that I appreciate you framing it, that the violence is something that Warrior faces when he leaves his mother and father's home. It was really important to me that Warrior be really cocooned in love, love of family, love of his people, love of his sister, love of his mother, of his father, that his home space be places where music and culture, love and history, good food, sometimes a bit too much liquor, sometimes, a lot of storytelling, but that kind of warmth of home that he's surrounded by was really important, because I think too often the stories of, young Black people in general, and definitely young Black men in this space in urban environments, are one of bereftness or one of deficit. And I really wanted him to be based in love and support, and that what he faced, outside of his home was the violence. And there's no, question that I intentionally wrote this book in ways that have kind of a mythical tone to them. There's an aspect of it that's a parable. And, there are characters that are both, real and representational. And so the world outside of his parents' home is America, right? The world, all the ills and the norms that we know are outside of his parents' home. And what is inside is the home space that's been so important, I think, for survival. Black people had to create home space for survival during slavery, obviously during segregation, and still today. How do you protect and cocoon your children so that they can survive the realities of what can be America? And so I think that from my perspective is, if you're going to look at a historical context of the African-American experience in this country, it was birthed in violence. The taking of, human bodies from the continent of Africa was violence. The Middle Passage was violence. Slavery was violence. Segregation in many ways was violence. And so I think the reason you see it so consistently as a line is because the historical realities of the intersection of violence and the Black experience in this country, that the Black body was controlled, Black male body and female body controlled, literally, used for profit in this country. And so how do you not investigate that if you are part of this African-American historical novel tradition, if that's the part of the story that you're telling? Obviously that is nowhere close to the only story, but that is a essential part of the story. I always think of Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk talking about racism being a veil, that you see everything, you see the world, but your Blackness is something that's constantly with you, and you're looking through this veil at everything you see throughout the day. And I think Black people know that experience all too well, that maybe not every aspect of your day, but constantly in your day, in your week, in your life, there's a lens that you bring to it that is seeing it through the lens of being Black in America. And I think that for young Black men growing up in urban experiences, violence is also a part of that. It's this kind of ambient sense of violence. Violence doesn't happen every day. Violence might not happen every week, but you think about violence when you're walking down a block, which corner you turn, which neighborhood you're in, the possibility of violence from the police, the possibility of violence from people who look just like you, the possibility of a basketball game turning into violence, a barbecue turning into violence. There's this feeling of kind of an ambient sense of violence and being prepared for it. And, as I talk about in the novel, that often produces this feeling of wearing a mask, of guarding yourself. And that can be protective, and that can be something that's very necessary, but it can also be at times destructive internally, right? That we are gentle, loving, sweet, affectionate people. And what does it mean to put a mask on to kind of navigate through society? We were very involved at Brother and Sister Soul in the effort to push back on stop and frisk in the city. This was a policy in New York that criminalized generations of Black and brown men. Every Black man at our organization was stopped and frisked, me 4 times in Harlem. You started to just expect it. You started to prepare for it. What does that do to the psyche? And I was trying to really investigate that this is also intentionally a very internal book, with a lot of the narration being in Warrior's mind. I wanted to bring the reader into his mind of what it felt like every single day. to be a Black young man, a Black boy emerging into manhood. I haven't read a lot of books where that's been the narration, and to bring you into his psyche was important to me. But I also think it's this, this real challenge of the spiritual and the physical. So you ask about how I represent violence for the different characters in Passage. And so, yes, part of that is the letter with his, best friend, his brother. We know that the prison industrial complex, the prison system is violence. It's a system of violence. We put over 2 million people in cages in this country, human beings. But the reason I chose kind of the spiritual side, the terror of the wolves chasing him, was to try to get to that ambient sense of violence, that feeling that he was always being pursued by this. The novel begins with a metaphorical death. That is what is supposed to be represented by the first chapter, which of course has, its most brutal scene of, the beating of Brother Man, and the removing of the eyes, the taking of the eyes of this young boy. And much of that is based in history and reality. It's based in family experiences. We know the history of police violence in this country and state violence, but my father's first cousin had his eyes kicked out by the NYPD. And I, heard that story in the 80s when it happened. And, that is scarring to a child to hear that in as a child, that this has happened. And that always stood with me about what does it kind of mean to remove, one's eyes? What does it mean to be a witness to something when actually the act of violence was the removal of one's eyes? And so, I think I want him to struggle with that. I want him to struggle with the violence that's all around him, but also for the reader to feel that this is a very sweet, gentle, loving person too, loving to his sister, loving to his people, loving to his community, but also he's ready for that violence if it comes. And I just think that it's so often, not always, there is no one, consistent linear experience for Black women or for Black men in the country. There's so many different experiences. But a very common experience is this struggle with violence, what it does to your psyche, how you defend yourself from it. And I really wanted to capture that in the novel.